It's my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Jennie-Marie Larsen, who is the founder of the Foundation for Planetary Intelligence. She's based in France, and she has a great passion for the environment. And today, we want to talk about a matter which affects the British voters, the members of the Conservative Party, as well as everybody else on this planet. It's the issue of climate change and its implications for British politics. Jennie-Marie, have you followed the recent developments in British politics? And in particular, I would like to focus on the performance of the outgoing Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, in terms of his handling of the climate change issue. What are your impressions of that matter?
Well, thank you so much, Nirgunan. I'm happy to be talking about this because it's a really interesting subject that few are really bringing to the forefront, that despite the many foibles that led to the end of the Johnson administration, he was in fact the UK's greenest prime minister in history. So the UK has achieved a unique position amongst G7 nations, is that there is actually bipartisan agreement on climate change as a critical issue. So Boris Johnson, apparently going into office, had a briefing by the chief scientist for the UK, Sir Patrick Vallance. And apparently this briefing freaked him out. And Johnson has always had a personal commitment to nature and conservation. And this briefing, in fact, set him on a personal research mission. So he has, throughout the leadership, he has kept the net zero targets at the forefront of UK politics. He upheld the law introduced into the UK in 2019 of reaching net zero by 2050. And he truly has been one of the top climate leaders in the G7. So he used COP26 to the fullest extent. He appointed Alok Sharma as president of COP. And as a result of the meetings, they came away with 50% methane reduction targets by 2030, which matters a lot because methane is 70 times more heating than CO2 in the atmosphere. They agreed to end deforestation by 2030. They agreed to 30% electrification of the planet by 2030. That's 300 million people worldwide who will have access to energy who do not now. So all in all, actually, Johnson was an excellent prime minister from a climate perspective.
That's a very interesting perspective, and it's a perspective that many people haven't heard in terms of the political debates that are taking place in the UK at the moment. In terms of Mr. Johnson's successors, we find that there are two candidates who are now frontrunners. In fact, the list has been whittled down to two candidates, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. Which of these two candidates would you say has the most progressive views on climate change?
Well, I understand that Rishi Sunak did agree to uphold the law of net zero by 2050. And I'm not sure if Liz Truss has done the same. But the onus is on this next prime minister to continue to take the legacy of the UK as a leader in the G7 on climate action. So it was quite unfortunate that at the time when the candidate pool was at 10 for the next premiership, that Sir Patrick Vallance offered again to do the scientific briefing, and none of them showed up, which is really quite disappointing because it doesn't take a lot of information to understand, for example, the emissions mix. And it's very easy without doing your homework to focus on things like eat less meat, important, travel less by plane, important, but really not more than 2% of the energy mix or the emissions mix, or driving electric vehicles, also important, but not that important, less than 5% of the emissions mix. So it is the onus of an incoming leader to actually do the homework on an issue that is facing everyone in their population and everyone worldwide. The temperatures were over 40 degrees Celsius this week in the UK, which is the all-time hottest temperature ever recorded in the country. And there were tarmacs that were shut down at Luton Airport because it was beginning to melt. There were trains that were no longer safe to take because the tracks were beginning to melt and expand. There was a bridge that was covered in tin foil, apparently, because it was starting to melt. So the UK is not ready to face these temperatures, and they're coming much faster than even the scientific community predicted. So yes, energy prices are a concern, and cost of living, that is a concern, but that's a very short-term view on what issues are critical for the UK population. So I think between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, it will be interesting to see who will understand the long-term view of what focus needs to be in the coming years of their leadership.
That's very interesting. In terms of the future, which aspect of climate change should the candidates focus on? You mentioned the appropriate emissions mix. Which emissions mix, or what recommended emissions mix would be the one that the candidates should focus on?
Well, they should really try to always apply the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle, which is the 20% to focus on that will have the 80% impact. So in the emissions mix, 30% is associated with how we power things, electricity. 30% is associated with land use. So there's a reason deforestation is so important to end, is because the land is being deforested to be used to provide feed for cattle. And 70% of agricultural land is feed for livestock, which is not a reasonable mix. So these are some of the changes that need to be looked at. And rewilding land, which is something that Johnson focused a lot on, that is carbon sequestration of nature-based solutions. Then there's also the business of making things. So making cement, making plastics, making metals, making things represents 30% of the emissions mix. So these are big, big areas that need focusing on, and building efficiency. We're losing 25% of energy in buildings because they're not properly insulated. So buildings matter a lot in a city. Air pollution has been, highly addressed in London, but it doesn't actually take care of the emissions piece. So our real absolute goal is to bring down emissions, and they must be reduced by 50% by 2030. We're not on track for that. We're not on track to meet 1.5 degrees limiting of warming. We're probably going to hit that by 2030. So it really is up to the next leader to do the deep study, understand where the emissions mix comes from, specifically in the UK, and which areas can be addressed.
That's very interesting, and I hope both candidates, as well as the eventual winner, realize the magnitude of the crisis that we are facing. One last question. You mentioned that the railway tracks are melting in this record heat wave. You mentioned that the tarmac is boiling. What is the likelihood of the record temperatures being surpassed if these measures are not taken?
Oh, I think it's a certainty. This will not be the end of the heat waves. I live in southwest France, and the wildfires that have raged here are 30 kilometers from my house. We woke up one morning to red skies and smoke-filled air. It's just going to continue. The unfortunate fact is that actually all of the science has underestimated the speed with which this will develop. So it might be a blessing in disguise that we are beginning to see the effects right here, right now in our backyards, because hopefully more people will wake up and understand that you need to do some study, you need to understand what's going on and decide what role you can play in this. 70% of the UK population agree that they want tougher action on climate. So the UK's next Prime Minister needs to actually respect the will of the people.
Thank you very much for your answers and your eloquent statements. We look forward to further discussions on this topic, which is of pivotal significance to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nirgunan.